بينا نبالي غرورنا وبعرنا جنت ليه يومك ماماي غروبنا حتى لك عمان تايب غرورنا وبعرنا نكملو نوش نوابينا نتكللو قبيلنا من دبلو وتايو من دمرو تايو حسرو
It was the second promising mission after the strategic withdrawal in 1978. The Eritrean Liberation Front had seen the pros and cons of the offensive and chose to make a strategic retreat, even if it took them another decade to find a win-win opportunity. All the key locations were secured, but the Derg regime was gaining massive backing from the superpowers. For that reason, it was a wise decision to take that move. After a little more than a decade, the Fenkil Operation that opened the last and foremost gate towards independence was to be launched. The valiant liberation fighters, after the strategic retreat, spent the next decade until the Fenkil Operation in weakening the stronghold of the massive Derg commands. The 0 hour was approaching. Leaders of the Eritrean Liberation Army, along with the heroic fighters, assumed the key locations to take control of the port city of Massawa. Once the city is secured, the connection between the central command of the Derg in Asmara and the naval force, as well as the supply of arms, will be cut off. That way, the Eritrean liberation fighters will be able to march towards their final destination, Asmara.
This map pretty much shows how the valiant freedom fighters made the Fenkil Operation a reality. These red lines, red arrows, show how they attacked Massawa and how they cut off the enemy backup that could come to Massawa to assist the Derg military that was stationed here in the port city of Massawa.
The EPLF army commanders planned the operation very carefully, knowing that the Derg has a massive army and one of the biggest naval forces in Africa in the port city of Massawa. For that reason, they had to mobilize one wing from the sea, which the Derg commanders never expected, believing that the liberation fighters were not in a position to possess a naval brigade. The other offensive was to cut through Ginda and make sure no backup would mobilize from the central command. The other one came from the northern part through Sha'ib and along with the half of the command that mobilized through Ginda to launch their attack in Massawa. The 0 hour was a few minutes away. At around 6 in the morning, the first artilleries were fired to the key targets. was a fierce battle that demanded heavy sacrifice and an exponentially greater loss from the enemy side. The liberation fighters won the battle and the total liberation of Eritrea became inevitable. But the port city was left in ruins. After its loss, the DER commanders were turned to launch aerial bombardments on civilian targets in Massawa. Eritrean civilians called that day Qibtat, or despair. The port city is now celebrating its 21st anniversary of the Fenkil Operation. Owing to the unremitting efforts exerted to rebuild the war-torn city, it has now reassumed its title, the Pearl of the Red Sea.
This place is called Sigalet Katan. As you can see, it's bound by sea on both sides. But of course, the valiant freedom fighters had to cross this road to get a closer target against the enemy that was stationed at the naval base. To make this possible, heavy sacrifices had to be made.
The Sigalet Katan Causeway, the only corridor to the main city of Massawa, was one of the impossible to pass through. Now residents pass through it with their heads held high and at complete ease, especially at this month of the year, where Massawa celebrates its anniversary with pilgrims decorated to the maximum. What were once killing machines that were hit during the Fenkil Operation now stand as monuments of victory. The tanks that crossed the Sigalet Katan Causeway, the small motorboats that defied one of Africa's strongest naval force, stay testimony at the Northern Red Sea Regional Museum and the streets of Massawa.
These boats here put for display in front of the Northern Red Sea Regional Museum are among the ones that made great miracles against the Soviet-backed massive naval force of the Derg regime.
Except for the ones that were left as ruins of war, the entire Massawa has now become a dream city, not only for Eritrean nationals, but also for foreign visitors. Misty weather carrying pleasant breeze of the sea welcomes one to port city of Massawa and accompanies you with an atmosphere of festivity. Massawa is now celebrating its 21st anniversary of the Fenkil Operation, the operation that paved the way for the total liberation of the country.
بينا نتبالي غرورنا وبعضنا قلت ليه يومك ما ماري قلوبنا حتى لك عمان تايب غرورنا وبعضنا نقبلو نوش نوابينا نتكللو قبيلنا من دبلو ودايو من دمرو تاريخ فسرو
After 21 years of independence, Massawa has been turned into a city that kept its vintage beauty of architecture, early history, as well as contemporary junctures such as the Fenkil Operation. A handful of buildings such as the old Imperial Palace and the old naval base in Grar still remain in ruins. The stories both these places have is so profound that each needs to be told one at a time. This place here is one of the naval base seats of the Derg regime in Grar. This area commands the flow of artilleries and fighters from different directions of Massawa. One desperate Derg commander held a number of civilians hostage here, but the bargain ended to the valiant fighters' advantage. Every building in Massawa has its own history to tell. The Turkish carved buildings with classic Arab architectural touches, the Italian monumental buildings, the port, the hotels, and every single rock in Massawa was there during the demise of the Derg army and Massawa's independence. Now all of these buildings have been renovated without distorting their vintage beauty the port expanded to accommodate big ships, and hotels underwent intensive renovations to meet international standards. The war-torn city has now become a promising horizon of economic prosperity with the commencement of the free zone in Massawa. The strategic geographic advantage Eritrea is endowed with, coupled with the sea corridor that the Red Sea provides to the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, is a professionally proven favorable business environment. By creating such an area, one can imagine how many investors could be attracted, especially with the strategic location of Massawa and encouraging policies of the government. To put the infrastructure in place, especially in Massawa, began a few years after independence. As a matter of fact, the supply of electricity and other relevant social service rendering institutions were completed right after Massawa was freed. Today, a handful of warehouses and industrial establishments have been constructed for embarking various industrial tasks. Having this prepared, dozens of firms have already registered and some have even started at the free zone of Eritrea. Eritrea is located in one of the busiest shipping zones in the world. Nearly 20,000 vessels a year pass by Eritrea, loaded with some 700 million tons of cargo, more than 9% of the estimated 7.7 billion tons carried by global shipping. This year's celebrations, marking the 21st anniversary of Operation Fenkil, are currently underway in Massawa, a apiary for the total liberation of Eritrea. It's a theme that commemorates the grand heroic operations of that time, which signaled the definite triumph of Eritrea's struggle for independence. With all the preparations in full swing, the infrastructure intact and business interests high, it is definite that the spillover for Eritrea could be substantial. Employment and training for locals, development of foreign trade links, and a conduit for local products like fruit, livestock, fish, and minerals. Looking back to the past years of colonialism, despite the vast sea that stretched ahead like a magnetic carpet, the port city of Massawa looked like a ghost city with a faint pulse of life some 20 years ago. The inhabitants of the city, who were considered as second citizens in their own land, lived their life in constant fear, frustration, and pent-up anger they harbored for ages. There was no bustling and interactions of people or any kind of activity that is a must in other port cities all over the world. There were no development or progress results either. On the contrary, everything seemed to deteriorate and fade away. The beauty of that beautiful port city was testimony of a brunt of war. During the colonization period, the inhabitants of Massawa had shortage of social services, hospitals, schools, transportation and communications, infrastructures, and some necessary services. However, after gaining the liberation, every corner of the nation was bestowed with all the important social services, almost throughout the nation. The inhabitants of Massawa were finally free to move around without any fear of harassment and curfew imposed. After a long time, its residents were able to explore their own land without any restriction, and they do have a sense of security and delight while walking on the beautiful streets of the city. Massawa City, owing to the historic Operation Fenkil, is putting on promising prospects of prosperity and social justice. In the same way, it paved the way for total liberation. It is indeed enjoying the benefits of independence thanks to the substantial investment made to rehabilitate and modernize the war-ravaged infrastructure of the port city. The city of Massawa, as always, enthusiastically readied itself for active popular participation to colorfully commemorate the 21st anniversary of the Operation Fenkil. Marching parade and carnival programs have been conducted with the participation of the general public, students and youth, as well as members of the Defense Force, national construction companies and various institutions. The port city of Massawa still has so many interesting stories to share and be explored under the Fenkil operation. Today, the city is embellished by a number of new buildings, schools, hospitals and hotels. It is very hard for anyone to imagine what had been done to its inhabitants and to the city before 20 years. Having this in mind, thousands of people at this month of the year visit the port city of Massawa to witness the rebirth of the once war-torn city and give tribute for those who had struggled to give us this moment by sacrificing their precious lives.